So, our next speaker slash guest slash team member is the brains behind these designs, like everything from the website, from our banners, from our tags, from everything you hold in your hands. So this festival's design is actually awarded from blogs that award, the best designs. So he's a team member also with the most difficult name to pronounce when you look at it. So to coordinate our panel, we welcome on stage Garrod O'Rourke, right? Mr. Zopos, Henry, and Andy will join him on stage. Get ready for your questions.
Okay, guys, we're going to run this as follows. We've had some questions from you guys on Twitter, so we're going to go through those first. I have some questions from listening to guys talk. Hopefully, we won't even need to use those. I think these guys are going to have a conversation around your questions and maybe expand on some of the things they've talked about during the presentations. Just to let you know, you need to keep sending in questions all through the presentations. I'm sitting there on my laptop, on Twitter, watching for them, listening. And there's some really good questions coming in, so I want to keep those going. So the first one is, I suppose, kind of aimed at Henry, but I think it's applicable to all the businesses you've run. It's a question from Elada, or Eleda. This is going to be quite funny, by the way. I don't speak Cypriot, so the pronunciation of the names might get a bit funny. She wants to know, do you try to distinguish between what you will take you off course in terms of building tangents, like Sherlock, perhaps, and what will improve your idea? So you talked about focus, Andy, as well, and you talked about discovering opportunities in the market. How do you decide what's going to take you off in the wrong direction versus what might open up new avenues? Andy, maybe you talked about focus. You can jump on first.
Sure. So I think there's a difference between the direction you're going in overall, and that's the point about do you keep doing the same thing that you set out to do at the start, or does your direction change over time as you learn from learning things from talking to potential customers and users? And the direction you're going in is different from the number of things you're doing at one time. So taking something on board that makes you think, oh, maybe I should be going in this direction, or maybe adding this extra capability is different from building out multiple features, dealing with multiple different market sectors, trying to do too much at once. And so I think that that's the difference. So there's if I understand correctly, there's it's great to take on board feedback and use that to steer your direction, but the critical thing with focus is to not try and be all things to all people and try and do too many things at once.
Maybe one thing for me to add as well, can you guys hear me? One thing to add for me is that it's also important to figure out what kind of personality you are as a decision maker. How do you make decisions? Some people make decisions very emotionally, use their gut. They just think, they don't analyze things too much. They just follow their gut. And many great entrepreneurs are like that. And generally, when you tend to get more experienced, you tend to make more decisions in terms of instinct. So if you are more instinctive as a decision maker, it's better to actually focus more on doing much more analytical thinking before you jump into something. If you're somebody who's kind of analyzing things, the risk is the opposite. It's a bit of analysis by paralysis, some to put it. So you have to sometimes just follow your instinct. The second thing is also in terms of what stage you're in. If you're just starting up and you're just yourself plus maybe one or two more people, it's fairly easy to reach directional decisions, either with gut feel or with data. But if you're a larger group of people, if you're kind of 20, 30, 40, 100 people, it's also very important as to how do you get consensus, how you get the whole team to buy in. And that's a fundamental part of also how you go about it. And I think it's very, very important to have very open discussions and at some stage reach a decision which communicate, agreed upon, and just move on.
Fantastic. Following on from your point on being an instinctual leader or making decisions from instinct, Alex asked, how do you market a product when the people do not know they have a need for it yet? So you've discovered obviously some opportunity or a product you think is needed, but your marketplace doesn't need it yet. And that's obviously an instinctual decision. How do you handle that situation? Have either of you been in this situation before? Someone first.
Hello? Yeah, so I think there's a couple of really interesting points underneath that. The first one is the point about when you're innovating and it's about catching the wave at the right time. So the idea about not trying to do something that's too new and disruptive too early, and not trying to do it too late. So if you do it too early, so for example, there were people that are trying to do like online video streaming way before broadband, and it just didn't work because dial-up internet just didn't have the capability to support it. And so things like video conferencing, there was like a date at which point the technology was there that meant it could be possible to do it effectively. So if you tried to do it before that, then you were fighting a losing battle. And if you tried to do it after that, then someone else had already got there before you. So there's sort of the right timing point there. Sorry, can you remind me the...
The specific question was about like how do you market a product you think there's
Yeah.
a need for, but they don't really quite.
Yeah, sure. So that's like the first thing, which is about timing, because like once something is once something is known and once it's sort of common, then it's something that people recognize. But when it's before it comes of age, then you're much more likely, if you're going to be the person that is the first person to get something right and get something to market at scale, then it's quite likely that people will not know that they want it because it just hasn't existed before. So then the second part of that is kind of like the Steve Jobs kind of Apple thing versus a more functional thing, whereas there's kind of two ways to create something that people want. One is something they have a really big need for, and so their hair is on fire and they're screaming and crying out for it because they have a problem and they know they want it. Alternatively, it's something that they don't know they want it, but when you show it to them, it's like this is the Apple and the iPod is that they love it as soon as they see it because it's cool. And so either you're solving a problem for something or you're creating something that really excites them when they see it. And so I think trying to sell something to people that don't know they want it is dangerous territory, because you're very close to the area of the common trap of trying to sell something that they don't want it and they're never going to want it, and why would they even want it? It's just your crazy idea. So the safe ground for the vast majority of businesses, I think, is creating something to solve a problem, and then the question is how many people have this problem, and is it a really big problem that you can provide a lot of value by solving? And that's kind of a question of like how big is it, rather than is it worth doing or not. It'll be worth doing to some people. Maybe if it's a big successful company, it will be because it's worth doing to a lot of people to solve a really big pain point they're willing to pay a lot for. And if it's something that people don't yet know they want, then it's probably because you're only going to succeed if it's something that's super cool, that as soon as they see it, they're like, yeah, like I clearly want that.
One thing for me to add as well is also be humble about what you don't know. What we did, for example, in the early days with the One Fine States, I did lots of focus groups. I got a bunch of people, invited a bunch of random people at my house, and we asked them in a kind of organized way, and we videoed the whole thing to ask questions about how do you feel about this, how do you feel about that. A lot of decisions that consumers make, especially not businesses so much, are quite emotional decisions. They cannot be necessarily boiled down to a logical way of making a decision. So it's very important to listen very carefully as to what people value and why they value it, and you end up sometimes shaping your product or service around what people need.
You think also there's a quite tight correlation between the type of people who think they can go and change the world by starting a company and people who think they have a vision for where it's going and can sometimes ignore the advice that's apparent. I think there's a reasonably tight correlation.
Absolutely. If I knew what I know now about the air freight industry or the graduate recruitment space, I would have never done it. I mean, as Henry very rightly put, what was your word? You used hacking down domain expertise. And I called the industry politics. If I was aware of the industry politics before I came up with an idea and tried to do it, I would have never done it. I mean, sometimes you have to be kind of unaware of the risks to take them.
Yeah, I think there's another thing as well, which is if you're trying to build a product where you think you're trying to create a new need, and you're incredibly passionate about it, and you think that consumers or businesses could adopt that, I think the way that I tackle it is just starting really small. So, trying to create, a product that with as little effort as possible, where actually you can just test the core of your assumptions, so that you can understand in a very enclosed group whether or not people go, wow, oh my God, I never even thought this way before. Because at the end of the day, if you're giving somebody a product and they're looking at it and going, I'm not sure what to do with this, then you haven't got a match going on. So like if you're confident that there are needs there that you can create, I think the best way to do it is to work small, little as effort as possible to try and get to the core of that.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, there's famous examples of products or services that emerged from a completely different heritage. Examples that we know about, things like Listerine, the mouthwash. It started off, I believe, as a hair product. So at some stage, they listened to customers. I don't know how they did that, probably selling snake oil. But they ended up sort of converting, pivoting to being kind of a mouthwash. Or other companies doing things that you know very well, people like American Express. Febreze as well. American Express used to be a freight forwarder. How on earth it became one of the biggest kind of financial companies in the world is beyond belief.
You mentioned that if you knew what you knew now about freight, you'd never have gone in there. And you also mentioned in your talk about being battle-scarred, because you've been on a third startup now, Henry, you've had 3 startups, you're on your second. Like, what makes you keep going back? You're battle-scarred, it's a tough thing doing a startup, but yet you guys are obviously junkies through it. What makes you go back every time?
Oh, I think, you know, it's like if you're a startup person, it's like a disease, and you know, you do it because you just can't sleep if you're not trying to do something like new and challenging every day. And you know, whatever the area of interest that drives you within that might be, I think it's still that it comes down to, for me, it comes down to an urge of creating something new, and creating something new that helps people and solves things that in ways haven't been done before, and can provide a lot of value. And yeah, like it's like a lifestyle. It's a drive. It's, you know, it's what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I agree with Andy there. I think the motivations behind people who are entrepreneurs, who work in startups, it's actually quite wide-ranging. Some people are solving for knowledge, some people are solving for building something new, some people are solving for just money. It doesn't really matter what that is. I think people have different motivations, but I think there is a bit of self-selection going on here. People who end up being entrepreneurs are people who tend to self-select. You have got some incredible highs when you do this, and that's what drives most people, but there are also some incredible lows as well. And it's much more ups and downs than sort of getting a job. But that's what drives people. It's incredibly exciting.
And I'd add one other thing, which is, you know, I think that right now there is a wave of talent going into the tech industry. You know, things like this are taking place, and this is enormously exciting. And you know, the talent that would have used to have gone into other industries, the best of the best people who would have gone into banking and finance and management consultancy are actually taking a long, hard look and going, well, you know, is there another way? Should I be trying to actually generate a new business myself? And for me, I really enjoy working in an industry where there are such phenomenally inspiring people. It's an addictive thing to be able to just go and have a real life conversation with somebody about solving an insane problem that you never thought existed. And I think one of the my observation is one of the characteristics that seems to exist is an urge to want to problem solve, like their itches. And you know, I meant to say this quote in the around the perception of problems, but there's a consumer-facing bank in the UK that I'm not going to name, whose 72% of their workforce just take forms that their customers fill out and then put them into computers. 72% of tens of thousands of people. And you know, a bank may not look at like the management team of a bank may not look like at that like it's a problem. Whereas I think a lot of entrepreneurs would turn around and go, wow, that is a massive problem. How do I fix that? And it's just things like that, little itches, and you know, wanting to get up and solve those things every morning. And when I think you're solving a company, you have the big itch, which is the big problem that you're trying to solve. But then being an entrepreneur is very in the moment as well. And there's probably 2 or 3, if you can get it down to 2, that's wonderful, itches going on at any one time where you just have a burning desire to get up and fix them. And you know, that's very motivational as well.
We've established entrepreneurs are itchy. We had some very specific questions, I think following Andy's advice to ask specific questions about specific things. So I'm just going to dive into 1 or 2 of those. Stelios asked, did you regret quitting McKinsey? He said it might be the dream job for some people.
Absolutely not. I think that many people we see now have great sort of professional careers, professional services. They are the management consultants, investment bankers, lawyers who don't necessarily want to be in that world. I think I learned a lot from that environment. It was incredibly valuable for me personally, because obviously it's something that when you have little experience, you get exposed to things very, very quickly, and you deal with some incredible sort of problems and dealing with some very, very tangible things that you can deliver. But what I wanted to do is not just do something of my own. The motivation for me was to try and become more practical. As a management consultant, the main thing you do is advisory. Great consultants are people who basically go there and give great advice, and your clients listen to you. I wanted to just roll up my sleeves and get things done as well. I wasn't happy just giving the advice and then seeing the client not always take up the advice. And the reasons why somebody may not take up an advice is lots of kind of incredibly varied. There was lots of sort of defining moments at my time there, and I think one of them was, which really sort of made a big difference, was that one of the partners, we spent the whole weekend, we literally sort of killed ourselves over the weekend to finish the work and the presentations. And he came over the weekend on Sunday afternoon, and he goes through this kind of 250-page pack. He takes kind of the first page, he reorders a bit, he gets rid of half the stuff, and he just creates 3 bullet points and says, this is the one page I'm going to give to the client. And of course you can imagine sort of 3 young bucks there just sitting there sort of thinking, what the hell is this guy doing? He doesn't know what he's talking about. But he knew something, that the main thing you're selling, what you're selling to your client, is advice. And the best thing to do is to actually give them advice that they will take on or understand. So he had this knack for simplifying things to its bare bones and giving that advice. I wasn't just happy with that. I wanted to make sure that I will be beyond that, and I wanted to sort of roll up my sleeves. So yeah, I don't regret for a minute. I think it was the best decision I've ever made.
We also had a question from Vassos about how you price your products. One fine say, and Stripe, well, Stripe might be interesting, we'll talk about, and Evently as well. How do you decide on a pricing model? You want to go first?
I can go first if you want. In terms of, if you take One Fine Stay, it's an interesting one because it's effectively a new category of travel, and there are no real alternatives out there that we can compare ourselves. It's not easy to compare and say these guys do it this way, they're direct competitors. We don't really have any direct competitors in the same space, but we do know what guests pay for equivalent things, for example. And one of the main things we did even before we started was try and figure out where do we anchor the commercial discussion, both because the marketplace, both with the hosts and with the guests. And we wanted to anchor the discussion with the guests around what they knew, and their alternatives would be hotels. So how much would you be paying in a hotel, and what would an equivalent home look like? So we used effectively value-based pricing to think about the commercials with guests. With hosts it was different. The trade-off there was, do you start an argument with the host about what's fair? It's about fairness. My home is great. It should be way more expensive than that. Or do you anchor to something which is a publicly available information? So the way we pitch it now to hosts is to say, look, either you know how much you're making, you want to make, and we'll agree with what you want, or you don't know, can advise you, or we'll tell you what you could be expecting. And then it effectively de-escalates the discussion, becomes a collaboration discussion with the hosts as opposed to a negotiation. And there's many metrics you can use. You can use, yields, rental yields as a proxy. You can use all sorts of things as a proxy. But the idea is, look, it's a partnership. If you accept a lower price, you have more flexibility on the pricing side, and therefore you can make more money. It's a trade between occupancy and price. So from our point of view, we use a variety of means. It's a fairly complicated space, but the gist of it is that, again, being open-minded.
Andy, in Stripe, slightly different scenario?
Sure, with Stripe, although actually I did loads of work on pricing at Group Spaces. One of the big observations I made through going through that was that, in my experience, the vast majority of startups underprice from the beginning. And there's underpricing is really dangerous because you actually can raise prices without anywhere near as much trouble as you think you can. And you can always do things like grandfather in existing customers with the previous prices, to, if necessary or useful, to smooth over the bumps. But if you start with a high anchor price and it's too high, then it's very easy to not only drop prices but also to test pricing. And so, how many people are familiar with A/B testing, where you you take like a couple of different versions of the same thing and show half to one group of users or customers and half to another and see how people interact with it. And the thing that struck me about, so testing is great in general, but how do you test pricing? Because it seems like if you show one price to one person and another price to another person, and then those two people talk to each other, and then like you're very clearly going to get like a bad reputation, or people are going to get angry. But the interesting thing is when someone showed me the light here that you can test pricing using discounts. So basically you just like have discount codes that you make them really, really easy to find. So you start with a high price and then just do like run Google AdWords for your own product, which is like, you know, discount promotion code. And you can test, like try and find your correct price point. The other thing that I know we made a mistake with Group Spaces is not trying to think through pricing enough in relation to the other costs involved in your business. And so, for example, like at the very most basic level, you need to make more money per customer than it costs you to acquire them, because otherwise, if you're making a net loss on each individual customer, you just can't make it up at scale. It doesn't work. And so having an idea of like how much it costs you to acquire a customer, whether that's you're actually paying money to buy them through Google AdWords or something, or whether it's like an indirect cost through, you know, employing a salesperson or something like that, how much you're spending to get a customer, and then how much profit or how much money you're getting in revenue from that customer. Once you've figured out that, you know, 10% of customers convert to paying or sign up or whatever, and then 10%, you know, stick around after a month or a year or whatever it is, and then figure out like A, are you profitable in the long run, but B, like how soon before you become profitable, because it's much easier to scale a business if you're profitable on a per customer basis within a short amount of time. So if you break even on a customer after 1 month, then in month 2 you can start reinvesting that revenue into growing your company. Whereas if you might make a huge amount of money through high prices in the long run, but if it costs you a lot to acquire the customer and you only get profitable in year 2, then basically you need to get external funding to fund you through the first year and a half, 2 years, until you can start growing based on your own revenue. The other thing about pricing that I know with Group Spaces and Stripe, it's like the only thing that where your competitors, you know, I think it's the only area where you should be looking at what your competitors are doing. So in general, you shouldn't be worried about your competitors and what they're doing. You should be worried about your customers and what they want. But with pricing, it is very relevant to look at what the market is doing and figure out how your customers will be perceiving you. Do you want to be perceived as the quality product, or as the average price, or as the simple, cheap, economy option? I think that's well worth thinking about.
I would completely agree with your observation on startups underpricing. I mean, I think it's a mistake that we made at the beginning too. We actually went rather risk aversely for a cost-based pricing, where we were getting back the customer acquisition cost after 4 months, and then everything after that was we were making money on, which was actually a great model for a software startup, for a SaaS product. But what I would say is that the reality was that the value-based pricing was a lot higher than the cost-based pricing, and we hadn't realized that. So the way that we went about testing that was, as you said, we actually kept our pricing very opaque, which I know flies in the face of what software as a service businesses like doing. They like having a big pricing page there. But actually, I think, if I was going to do another SaaS business, I'd actually keep the pricing opaque again for a year, and just be having phone calls and understanding actually what I can charge. Because and I think the discounting is a great idea, but the reality is the chances of 2 customers speaking to each other is pretty low usually, unless it's a really small market. But in reality, I wish I'd done a value-based pricing much earlier than we did.
We have one more question from Twitter, and then we're going to open to the floor. So start thinking about your questions. We've got some people in yellow T-shirts going around with roving microphones. They'll wave at you. The last question from Twitter is kind of a big one, but we'll try and keep short answers to it so we can get to the floor as well. Anon asked, what would it take for Cyprus to have a thriving startup scene similar to Israel, or for you guys, similar to London? I'm not really sure what the startup scene is like here, so maybe a bit of context would help. But what does it take to grow a startup scene where maybe there isn't a very vibrant one? Demetrios, you probably have the best local knowledge. You can jump in first.
I guess I'll take this one, given that I'm kind of the Cypriot on the panel here. I would say it's incredibly hard. It's very, very hard for a variety of reasons. I think there's cultural reasons why this doesn't exist, but there's also some very, very practical reasons. On the cultural side, I think the way I describe that is that Cyprus is a small country and it's an island. It's an island nation, and I think the business culture here typically is a trader culture, and you see lots of people who are great traders. People are very commercial here, very entrepreneurial, by the way, in terms of the business culture. So that's great. That's a big tick. But there's no tradition here of new business build. Because of that, it's a very small domestic market. You don't benefit from the same advantages you have when you have got a very large captive domestic market. If you're starting in Silicon Valley, you've got a market of 250 million people be able to test your product. So when you're doing intermediary businesses, information-driven businesses, tech businesses, people in America don't tend to think even outside America. Let's just do it, let's launch it, let's make it very successful, let's make it very profitable. And even then they start thinking about international. You don't need to internationalize if you're a US company. In Cyprus, you just cannot do that. The market is far too small. So if you want to build a scale business here, a tech scale business, or a tech-enabled scale business, you've got it for export. It's very hard. But beyond that, beyond the cultural aspects of the market size, I think there's also the concept, the interplay between sort of the three various factors in the mix. One is venture capital, money basically, financing. Two is people, having a good pool of people who are not just only trained technically, especially engineers, they're also people who have had the experience to go into context and learn from other people having built stuff, i.e. Context-based experience. And the third one is ideas. And I think that that nexus between the venture capital community, the ideas and engineers exists in abundance in Silicon Valley and also in Israel in some domains. In some domains that exist in Israel, and there's a lot of money sloshing around there. In Cyprus, I wouldn't say that's the case. I think funding here is much more traditional, and that's why I think to get there, it will take, I think, many years of trying. I don't think it's that obvious, actually.
Well, I mean, everything I've know about the Cyprus entrepreneurial scene I've sort of learned in the last 4 hours. I can't really share anything there that I doubt anyone else will already know much more about. But I think the interesting observation is this wider question of, I see it over and over again, is that what will it take for city X or country X to get more like location Y? And in London, we've been through this a lot over the last years. London has a complex about what does it take to be Silicon Valley? Berlin has a complex about what does it take to be London? Cyprus is maybe asking what does it take to be Berlin? And you see a pattern here. And the message of hope that I have is sitting in London. I've been in London for 4 years, and London now is completely different as an entrepreneurial community to what it was just 3 years ago. When I first moved to London, we spoke to everyone we knew. It was when we just raised VC funding, and we were moving from Oxford, an hour outside London, down to the city. And we spoke to everyone we knew, and we said, where should we get office space? And everyone we spoke to, 20 plus people, gave us one of 3 answers. It was you should rent desks in this company that have spare desks, or this company, or this other company, all in this single area. And that was the answer. And fast forward 3 years, and London has 26 co-working spaces, which is just fantastic. This didn't exist 3 years ago. And on a similar side, on the investment side, London, sure, 3 years ago had any number of VCs, of which only maybe 3 or 4 were the really big major VCs putting serious money into tech. And then there was a longer tail of VCs that did deals and here and there and in other sectors. And today, London has maybe 5 or 6 VC firms and smaller firms that have popped up. With Attaché, for example, represents one today that just didn't exist 3-4 years ago. That a very exciting opportunity for companies in London. 3 years ago, and it's with these options, it's much more accessible to raise early stage capital. And so the message is that it's not necessarily about trying to be some other place. And I think that places like the Valley are unique in terms of their history and what's gone on there. London will never be Silicon Valley, but London will be a better London. And in that respect, I would look to every location. I think it's really exciting what's happening here today, and think about if London can change in such a short amount of time, look at what changes London has been going through and what changes Berlin has been going through and what changes are happening here. And even just projecting forward a couple of years, I think it's really exciting. It just takes a bit of will and a bit of movement and a bit of opportunity.
I'm going to throw it to the floor now. Do we have any questions? Yes, we have a question here. Someone coming with a microphone right now. Coming very quickly. Okay, well, yes.
All right. You hear me, yeah?
Yep.
Right. I wanted to know if there is any virtual market where anyone can apply for solving any kind of problem. So let's say within my project I have a concept, I have a problem, and I need to solve it, and I need an expertise. And instead of going to the company in Cyprus trying to find a very sometimes expensive solution, I can just apply for the market which exists virtually somewhere, and I will find somebody who will be able and willing to solve the problem with a payment, of course.
Guys, anyone going to help me out here?
Is Simos here from People Per Hour? Because, yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean,
this is the only one, yeah?
Sorry?
And this is the only one.
There's only one, yeah. No, there are many. I think the answer to that question is not one, like, be-all answer about where you go for a market for everything, but a lot of different answers about different things. And there's a lot of like innovation in marketplaces, whether it's about for you know, things like People Per Hour, where it's about for talent. There's all sorts of marketplaces expanding around talent on different terms, on different bases, whether it's you need someone for an hour to, you know, give you some help with a translation, or you need someone for a day to give you some help from graphic design, or you need someone to be more like a consultancy. I mean, you know, I think the answer to that question is split between, you know, the McKinsey consultants at one level to the, you know, someone helping out for an hour. I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine a while back about like the problems with LinkedIn. So I don't know how prevalent LinkedIn is here. I know Zing is also used throughout Europe, you know, the online network for basically listing your professional profile. And you know, LinkedIn has the potential to be so great, but it's such a such a broken system in so many ways. It's supposed to be my contacts like list where like everyone I've ever connected to professionally, and yet there is just no easy way that I can like even quite apart from finding someone new, even just network with my list of contacts. And it's funny because Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, has this sort of startup-y, you know, advice quote about like, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of the products you launch, then you've launched too late. Meaning, he means that you should always launch, you know, quickly and then get feedback. But some wag on Twitter said the other day that the problem is that LinkedIn is still embarrassing, like, you know, years later. And yeah, so I think the answer there is it'll vary, you know, completely based on what you're looking for, and, you know, specific areas of expertise. If you're looking for translation, it would be you'd look for a translation marketplace where you can, you know, find the right people. If you're looking for design services, then you try and, you know, blag Gero to help you out. And, you know, I think he likes a free beer here and there. You never know your luck. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the next question I had, sorry, to keep it. Sometimes when you do something innovating, the new concept or new idea, a new project, you disrupt the structure that exists in the industry. For example, One Fine Stay or Airbnb, etc. And I know that in New York, especially in the state of New York, they've been they had application of a new piece of law which says that the short lets are not allowed until it is 30 days of length. So what do you do when you disrupt the industry and there are forces like hotels, big names, etc., and they are after you to get you because you're actually on their way and they understand the potential threat that you're creating? Right?
It's an opportunity to pick a fight with the Attorney General of New York City right here, so
yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, so this is true. What you're saying is true, that disruption brings change to status quo. And that's what I try to present with innovation, that every innovation does that. And the way when you shake things up, where you'll end up would vary from situation to situation. In our case, in New York specifically, the original legislation there, it's called the Multiple Dwellings Law, was not passed by an industry lobby. That was not created by the hotel industry there, for example. That was actually a result of the downturn and people complaining about so-called slumlords. You had effectively unoccupied buildings, and there's lots of details which I don't want to get into here, which is why this was caused by the past legislation, which was not well thought through And it made things very difficult for people who are, for example, freelancers working from home, renting their homes out of town. So it effectively made something which was previously perfectly fine in an industry that did not have any collaborative consumption, and made things very difficult for those people. Now, that law applies only for a specific sub-segment of the market. And by the way, every major city in the world has similar piece of zoning legislation. It's not just New York, it's London, it's Paris, it's Los Angeles. Every single big city in the world has the same. Berlin has it, Barcelona has it, Madrid has it, everything has it. So what do you do in that situation? In London, for example, many of the local bylaws were passed in the early 1970s. Forget collaborative consumption. There was no internet at the time. They were not passed at the time. So in many jurisdictions where more enlightened public policymakers are viewing this, they realize that it has to change. But sometimes the only way to change it is to make sure that, you do something, you disrupt it, and then you let the public policy system do that, which is always going to be lagging behind. You'll never have public policy being a leader. It'll always follow the trend. And there's many, many examples out there where a regulated market has been disrupted by an innovation. And you don't have to go further out than Cyprus to see that. Look, for example, how every single lobby in Cyprus tries to lobby for their own bit to protect something or other, when it's evident that for the customer, it's very beneficial to have it. Be that from you arrive at the airport and you try to get a taxi anywhere, and guess what? Look at the prices. It's the most expensive taxi country in the world. It's ridiculous. And when you try to basically have a transportation system which tries to give better value to the customer, of course you're going to go up against interest. There's no doubt. But does it mean that you should not do that? I don't think so. I do think in the long term, if what you're betting on is that the consumer value you'll create is bigger than the disruption of the lobby, you'll win in the long run. And I'm a very, very firm believer that in our case, in One Fine Stays case, is that we're effectively going to pit taxpayers, people who, day-to-day people who want to make some extra money, especially in the downturn, against an industry lobby. Who's going to win in the long run? Taxpayers will.
So we have time for one short last question. There's a gentleman here in the second row with a lanyard. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if when you're going through the different sort of phases of creating a product for the market, what are the warning signs? No, not the warning signs. What are the clues that if things are not going as projected, you actually have collected in your process enough elements to actually repackage the original idea as a different viable product? In other words, to pivot to something equally viable and potentially successful where your original idea isn't going to work. And by the same token, do you recommend having a kind of plan to pivot to, a plan X in your back pocket before you, well, at the very, very early phase when you're starting out, you're beginning your startup? Thanks.
Who wants to jump in first? Andy, you look eager.
Sure. Okay, so I think this is one of those classic areas, like I was hoping to allude to a similar sort of thing in my talk, where it's really easy to get bogged down in the details when actually the answer could be very different in very different cases. So the key thing about, like, how do you work out when you need to pivot? Basically, when the general answer is like when things aren't working out. But that's kind of tricky to get your fingers on, right? So Eric Ries in the Lean Startup talks about actually setting your targets in advance. So you say, right, well, in X weeks' time or months' time, like, we're going to have achieved X. And if we can't achieve X, then we will agree it now that this will mean that maybe it wasn't possible to do this, or it was possible but it was too hard, and therefore we should look at doing something easier to do. One of the best pieces of advice I got from one of my investors was at a time when we were thinking about how things have been going with group spaces very late on, and he said, well, you've got a great team and you're working really hard, but progress is happening really slowly. And he said it's like you're playing in still water, whereas if you're playing in fast flowing water, then you'd be working very hard with the same team, but the momentum of what you were trying to do and like the market forces would be carrying you along, and so it would feel like, you know, it's all falls into place and it's easy. And I think that that's a lot to take away there in terms of when you really hit on something. The things that cause the real big companies to become really successful is when the market and their customers are all pushing in the same direction as them. And maybe not at the beginning, but when they change a few things. So for me, you know, looking forward, what I'm trying to do is always look to be working on something where it feels like, you know, it feels that my biggest problem is like making improvements fast enough because people want it. And if anything else, then I should always be asking myself, what am I doing wrong that means that I'm not in the right area, and what should I be changing dramatically? What should I be pivoting to find something that where it's that, you know, what I'm doing is just received a lot more positively.
Henry, this kind of relates quite closely to what your talk was about. Do you want to jump in on this?
So I think there's a couple of places to start here. I think firstly it depends like how, from my perspective, it depends how early it is. Like if you're right at the beginning and you're just trying to test a product, see if it works on a group of customers or a group of businesses, a group of consumers or a group of businesses, then you know, I think, as Andy said, like setting targets and really understanding when people are interacting with the product and the kind of value that they're getting out of it through things like, and understanding that through things like qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis, then I think you're just trying to create the set of data points from which you can say, well, actually this product is working or it isn't. And you know, I think increasingly these things are, well, with the more experience that I've got, these things feel more binary than they ever did. I don't know about you guys, but you know, it's the halfway house isn't necessarily ever that good a sign. Whereas you know, as Andy said, alluding to wanting to work on something that always feels like it has momentum and customers coming back saying, I love it, how do I change this, how do I change that, and being really interested in your product versus, you know, for example, not being able to get a customer to answer your call really quickly to have a decent conversation about it. Those kind of things. There's loads of like little data points that are not great signs for you to say, well, let's keep on going with this. But the reality is, you know, if you're getting close to your customers as part of that process, you know, I think one of the feelings when people talked about pivoting at the originally was that you're getting sufficiently close to your customers that you're actually setting a whole new set of data points that enable you to pivot because you've built up an understanding that you didn't have before and actually realized, well, I was going in this direction, but actually all of the analysis that I've done tells me that the opportunity is actually at a tangent.
We're going to have to leave it there because I'm getting frantic hand signals. It's time to move on to the workshops. I want to thank you guys for asking questions on Twitter and from the audience, and thank each of the speakers today. I think it was a really insightful panel. We're going to move on to the workshops next. I'm sure someone from the team will come up and explain what's happening. Thank you all very much.